morning, gentlemen and ladies. Scott Fody from DEC.
Scott.
Kind of loud. I'm with DEC Region 8. I work in the Avon headquarters of DEC for Region 8, and I work in the Division of Materials Management. We just got our name changed. We used to be the Division of Solid and Hazardous Materials, but these political appointees that pass through our offices like to change our names fairly often. So now we're Division of Materials Management, but we are responsible for regulating the landfills. In this region of the state, we have the majority, actually, of the landfills in the entire state. Our 11-county region from down here in Chemung and Steuben counties up to Lake Ontario through Rochester has 6 of the 8 biggest landfills in the state within our region. So we have a lot of experience regulating the landfills, and we're backed by our central office technical staff. There's a whole raft of people in Albany in our same division that support our activities, and that's where a lot of the experts are, including our radiation experts that I'll probably be mentioning later. Vince wrote a letter to me in the middle of December asking for our department's determination on this issue of disposal of Marcellus Shale drill cuttings. And I've brought the letter with me. It would be in final form. I had to write draft on the top because we got a new commissioner yesterday. And the commissioner's name is supposed to be on the letterhead. So this is an unofficial non-commissioner.
You're going to get fired.
Yeah, that's why I wrote draft right now. And please share that with as many as you can get there. I'm keeping one just so I can speak off of it because this will be the basis for what I've talked about. I think most of the issues have been well addressed here by Vince and the folks that have been working on this with the county. I guess I'll start out by saying we at DEC have no preference at all whether this county's landfill decides to take in these cuttings or not. I've been asked, and our department has been asked, to make a determination on the regulatory appropriateness and the environmental appropriateness based on science and based on law about whether it's acceptable. And that's what I'll be providing today. DEC is not a proponent of a landfill taking this stuff, nor an opponent. We're completely neutral, but we can answer the technical questions. That's our role, and that's what I'll try to stick to here today. And just as a little background, I want to mention that some of what Vince was describing about the quality of this county's landfill is not just tooting the county's horn. This county's landfill is a very high quality, well-designed, well-engineered, and well-operated landfill. And Vince is correct that these standards, the double composite liner that was described here, and the capping requirements that we have under New York State law are the strictest in the nation. Landfills such as Steuben County's landfill, are built to a standard that would be acceptable as a hazardous waste landfill anywhere else in the country. We don't accept hazardous waste, but these landfills in New York State are designed to such a standard with these double composite liners, leachate detection systems, leachate collection, gas collection, and now gas combustion for energy production. This is the state of the art. These are the best landfills in the country. And Steuben County stands up there with the best in this state. But again, when we were asked this question in Vince's letter, I have in my response just addressed the regulatory and the environmental issues related to this issue of accepting the drill cuttings from the Marcellus Shale. And I guess I'll start there, and that my letter starts there by defining what we're talking about. And I won't do too much of this because Vince did this already, but I do want to make sure everyone understands that we're not talking anything about hydrofracturing. Nothing in this waste stream is at all related to hydrofracturing. These are the drill cuttings from that first boring down and out, which Vince described, and it's just the ground up rock that comes up the augers as that well boring is advanced through the rock. Later things happen in those well holes that involve, you all know. Everyone's concerned about what happens in the actual hydrofracturing process. That's not what we're describing here. We're just describing the drill cuttings that come from that first boring down. It is literally just the rock and the lubricants that are used with the drill bore as it goes through. A lot of those are surfactants, soapy type materials. The cuttings, as several people have mentioned, they look like coal-colored black dirt. I have, as I guess it sounds like Vince has been there, myself and my staff, our engineers and our geologists have gone down to a couple of the drilling sites in Pennsylvania to witness this stuff as it's generated and how it's handled there, how it's loaded up, and how it's hauled. And of course, we regulate these landfills very closely, and we've stood there at the landfill working face as these drill cuttings have been dumped off. I've played with the stuff. I've had, we gather it up, we fill bags with it, we bring it back to our office, and we play with it some more. I have geologists on my staff, and they love to do this kind of stuff. And my geologist laid out all the bags of the drill cuttings that we got from all different places, well sites and landfills, and got out his own radiation detector, this thing that the geologists use to look at different rock types. The first thing he did was get down off his shelf the different, because all geologists are rock collectors, so he's got these shelves with millions of different kinds of rocks. He's getting them down one at a time, and he's running his little handheld radiation detector over it, and showing how the needle deflects pretty good with all different kinds of rock. It also deflected with the Marcellus shale drill cuttings that we brought in, although I have to say to a lesser degree than some of these other collections of rock that he has, although I can't identify everything that he had there. But then what hit home most for me is, he said, Scott, run in your office and get that sample piece of granite countertop from when you had your kitchen redone. I use it as a paperweight on my desk. It's a piece of red granite. My countertop at home is made of this stuff. This was a sample. We brought it over, he ran the radiation detector over, it went way off the scale. 10 or more times as radioactive as the Marcellus shale drill cuttings were. So, I had not mentioned this to my wife, but the fact of the matter is, we're around this stuff all the time. He brought up bricks, pieces of concrete, many things that you deal with every day have degrees of radioactivity. And from these samples that we collected ourselves with our own hands and filled baggies full of, we found that the drill cuttings were less radioactive than a lot of the normal things we had available to us to test. So the definition of this stuff is just these drill cuttings. So we look at the regulations and try to decide, would there be any prohibition to a landfill accepting this stuff? And without getting into all of the regulatory references, I'll do them real quick. What we were able to do is step by step go through this. That definition of a hazardous waste comes from Federal Title 40, it's Part 261, and there's an exclusion in there for waste associated with the development or production of natural gas from being identified as hazardous waste. So we check that one off. It's not a hazardous waste under Federal Title 40. When we look at New York State's solid waste regulations, which are in Part 360, they also specifically exclude gas drilling waste from being defined as an industrial waste. So now we know it's not a hazardous waste, it's not an industrial waste under law. But when we read Part 360, the state's solid waste regulations, there's an additional thing that they say shouldn't go into landfills, and that's radioactive waste. So we had to determine under regulation whether these drill cuttings would be radioactive waste, and when you go to the Part 380 series of the state laws, you find that in 3 different places, naturally occurring radioactive materials of this type that are generated from gas production or any other type of working with rock and stone are not considered radioactive waste under regulation. So this kind of determination I don't do on my own. We also, besides the geologists and the engineers, we've got lots of lawyers. So we turn to the lawyers and say, have we looked at this correctly? Have we looked at every part of the law? Is there anything in regulation that says that a landfill cannot accept this material? The answer is no. The regulations are clear. This stuff is acceptable for disposal in a landfill. Okay. That's probably not the most important question, but we got to answer that question. First of all, is it legal? But I think the question most people are concerned about is it safe? And I think that's been well driven home by the presentation that Vince did and the report that he was describing. I'll just add a little bit. We looked at radioactivity as well as chemistry. There are some additives that, as this drill head goes down through the rock, to keep it cool and to keep it lubricated, they add a little bit of additive. On the way down, apparently, in the vertical portion of the well, it's usually water-based stuff, surfactants, and soapy materials. Sometimes, though, when they make the turn and start to go horizontal, they'll switch to either synthetic or vegetable-derived oil to be the lubricant. And when the cuttings come out, they'll have these materials in it, that little bit of oil, that little bit of surfactant. And so this is one of the things we have to consider. Is there anything in that, is there anything in that chemistry that would be inappropriate for disposal in a MSW landfill, in a Part 360 landfill like this county has? Analysis was done of the samples, and we found that no, there were no levels of chemicals, metals or organic chemicals that were above any standards that are appropriate for disposal in a landfill. In fact, many kinds of industrial waste that landfills like Steuben County take routinely have higher levels of all these kind of things. When it comes to the oil, some people were concerned about the fact that there's this vegetable oil or synthetic oil that can be part of this too. You look at the analysis of that, it's not a concern. Landfills like this one routinely take petroleum-contaminated soil from tank pull sites or vehicle accidents where there's been diesel fuel or something that's been spilled in the soil. The right thing to do is to dig up that soil and bring it to the landfill. And those levels of petroleum are significantly higher than you'd worry about in these drill cuttings. The other thing to take into account is at the well sites, they want to get as much back of these lubricant fluids as they can. So they bring that back out. They don't just ship the drill cuttings as they come out of the hole. They will try to draw out as much of those fluids as they can and reuse them. And the other reason is you got to bulk this stuff up, as it was described earlier. It comes out pretty wet, and we have a restriction on solids content or a restriction on liquid content in landfill materials. So they add the sawdust or lime or kiln dust to bulk it up. But those additives were what we were looking for when we did our chemistry on these drill cuttings, and we found that they would pass and be acceptable for disposal in the landfill. Just as an extra factor though, the landfills that are taking the drill cuttings for disposal are not taking them blindly. They're asking for analysis of the loads as they come in. If somebody says we've got 4 truckloads coming your way, the landfill says, send us your analysis, we'll decide if we'll approve it. They do that mostly for the oil-based. If somebody has drilled a well entirely with water-based lubricants, that may not be necessary, because really those are fairly innocuous. But any landfill can request as much data as they want before accepting a load of anything, and that's what the landfills, the other 3 landfills accepting these materials are doing with the oil-based cuttings. They're saying, send us your analysis, we'll decide if we'll accept it. So there's not only our knowledge that in general this stuff is safe to go into the landfills from that chemistry side, that can be confirmed with each load if you're interested in doing that. On the radiation side, I described some of the little tabletop exercises we did with the drill cuttings we collected, but we also had samples that had been collected at the landfills and also at the drill sites that were analyzed for the radioactivity. Some of that Vince discussed in the study that was done there. DEC also took some of its own samples. The drilling companies offer data from samples they've taken. It's all very, very consistent. We're talking about numbers between 1 and 4, roughly, picocuries per gram, regardless of where these drill cuttings are coming from. Now, because of budget cuts and that kind of thing, DEC doesn't have a ton of limitless money to be analyzing samples. There were people who were concerned about this technique of a company who has an interest in the outcome being involved in paying for the samples. Well, I got to tell you, it's very, very routine. In my 25 years with DEC, I've dealt with all kinds of bad guys. I used to work in the Albany office, and we had to deal with General Electric. You don't trust anything General Electric does. But you make sure you're watching every bit of it. And they pay for the studies. You know, we don't have the money to pay for a Hudson River or PCB study that needs to be done. It's many, many, many millions of dollars. But we watch them like a hawk as they do it. So please don't be suspicious about the process of collecting and analyzing samples. That's very routine. These consulting firms have professional engineers with licenses that they don't want to lose. And they're not in the business of falsifying data. So I hope we can all agree on the data and then talk about evaluation of that data. But it has been consistent that the radioactivity is in the range as Vince described, 1 to 4 picocuries per gram. The gentleman that mentioned someone else using their own money to take some samples, great idea. We would never turn, I didn't hear anyone up front say that's okay, but I'll say it. Great. Everybody else had one. The more samples, the better. It never hurts. It never hurts. If it makes people confident, I think it's a great thing. We'll find the same numbers that all the others have found. And, you know, as an engineer, I like data. You know, you can't have enough data. So that's not a bad thing. But again, we have found this to be pretty consistent. And I won't get into, I think Vince did a tremendous job of using all the real-world comparisons he could think of to show what these levels really mean. I mentioned my granite countertop. I'll throw out a couple other things. The Marcellus Shale is named after Marcellus, New York, up near Syracuse. I think Vince was saying that in our county, down here in Steuben County, it's at about 4,000 feet deep in the southern end and about 3,000 feet deep in the northern end, and that slope continues. And this rock layer outcrops. It comes to the surface in Marcellus, New York, and in a strip that goes all the way east-west across the state. There are people up there who live in it, live on it. They have their house basement dug in it. They have their wells drilled in it. Their children play on it every day. These drill cuttings are the same thing, only a ground-up version of that. If we're going to worry about these drill cuttings, especially going into such a high-tech landfill, then we ought to be clearing people out of that strip of New York State where they live right on this rock. In Albion, New York, which is another place to the west where this stuff outcrops, I have this old postcard at my desk. I should have brought it. It's one of those, you know, grainy 1890s postcards that shows an early photograph, and it's the Albion Courthouse building. It's a county building in Albion. It's built of blocks of Marcellus shale. They mine it up there. It can be used for construction. People work all day, 8 hours a day, in a building made of Marcellus shale. So I just throw a couple of things like that out there. Now let me throw one more in terms of how common this level of radiation is. Vince mentioned the landfills that take it now. One of them, Chemung County. One of them's over in Allegheny County. The third one's in this county. It's Hakes C&D landfill. And all of you who read the paper saw this summer, I can't remember exactly when, one of the dump trucks coming up from Pennsylvania full of drill cuttings from the Marcellus shale tipped over on Irwin Hollow Road, going up to that Hakes landfill. Dumped the shale cuttings all over the ground. We immediately got a call, because we regulate this landfill, and I've got a landfill monitor that covers that one, and an engineer who's there fairly often, and they saw this happen. So we utilized DEC spill crews, and the spill crew immediately hired a contractor who, normally they're dealing with petroleum, but we used the same kind of contractor, and they dug up all the shale cuttings and they put it back in the truck, and they took it back up to Hakes for disposal, where it was headed in the first place. But just to calm any fears and reassure anyone who still thought that this might be a problem, we went back and took samples of the soil in the area where it was all scraped off to show that all the shale was removed, and then went back with a radiation detector to find out if there was any residual radiation on the ground where the shale spilled, these shale cuttings. The problem we had was that we couldn't get a real reading off the ground, because right there, Irwin Hollow Creek has a cliff, a natural cliff. There was more radiation coming off that cliff than we could read anywhere on the ground. The natural shale rocks that were in that sandstone actually right there. But those sandstones are more radioactive than these drill cuttings. We couldn't even register anything from the spill because the cliff was higher. Yes?
Thanks for was that horizontal or vertical drill cuttings?
That was a vertical well, so it passed, as you can guess, you're going to have a higher concentration of Marcellus shale rock in a horizontally drilled well, because they've gone farther through. So out of, let's say, 4,000 feet down and 4,000 feet out, just for example, half of it's going to have been in that shale. This was water-based cuttings. The C&D landfill at Hakes can only take, we will only let them take the water-based cuttings. Because they don't have as sophisticated a liner design as say, the bathroom landfill does. So just knowing that was water-based cuttings, I'm guessing that was probably just a vertical well, because they usually do switch to the oil-based lubricants when they turn horizontal.
Can I ask one question? If the town of Marcellus, do you feel that the quantity and quality of the minerals, radioactive minerals in that area, that's at surface level, it gets leached from eons and eons of rain, and do you feel that that's the same as 3,000 or 4,000 feet deep? are we comparing apples and apples, or are we comparing apples and oranges? Do you feel that the content at 3,000 or 4,000 feet is different from what would be at the surface with the geologic cycle, where it gets to the hydrologic cycle, where it gets to wash out all of the minerals and stuff?
I'm only going to guess because I'm not a geologist. There may be some difference. I'd like to see some data. It'd be interesting to see some samples taken of the stone that's at the surface, this rock layer that's at the surface in north of us, in that part of New York State. But I don't think exposure to the air would necessarily lead to a reduction in the radioactivity that would show much of a difference from what's subsurface. I know when they drill these wells, one of them out of that formation. So they're already washed pretty well, and they've been subject to flowing liquid and stuff for eons down at depth as well.
Because I think it's kind of common knowledge, if you drill, the deeper you drill a water well, the more mineral rich it gets. And so if you drill deeper, you get more sulfur water, more iron water. So even at going up to 500 feet to a water well, if you go 100 feet down, you have less chance than if you drill down 500 feet of getting in heavy metals. So this just shows the hydrologic cycle, that even at 500 feet, you have a different game already, so let alone 3,000 or 4,000 feet down.
Yeah, but I think mineral chemistry is different than radiological considerations, and I'm not sure that exposure would have much of a difference. I don't want to speculate too much because we're starting to get into the realm of our experts in all of them. And that's, I guess, where I'll just switch real quick and tell you that all the studies that Vince described, the sample results that we have, weren't just looked at by regional staff. We have PhD radiation experts in Albany that their entire career is based on looking at this stuff, and not simply this issue that's come up in the last few years around here, but there are radioactive waste sites out by Buffalo that are working quality bad radioactive waste sites that these guys have been dealing with for decades. So these are real experts that came and reviewed the data and reviewed the studies that we have available to us. And I would defer to someone like that for this specific question you're asking. I think I love sample results. I think the sample would answer that. Up there in Marcellus or in Albion from that county building, it'd be interesting to take, scrape some of that rock, take a sample and see, is it any lower in radiation than stuff at depth? But I'm not sure.
Thank you. Are you comfortable that Casella, that's also hiring the same company that Steuben County is, that it's a very cozy relationship, that the samples that were gathered by Casella were handed over, and we don't know whether it was vertical.
I think these gentlemen have described very clearly that they know exactly where the samples came from. But
that's Casella offering. Casella stands to make money on this.
Okay. You're basically.
I think.
Thank you for letting me.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that.
I think just to finish that up, I think the data is good. I do trust the data. And if it were just this one group of samples, maybe not so much. But we've got data we've taken ourselves, data that's come from a number of different sources, and they're all showing us the same thing. If some citizens want to get together and generate their own data, I would love to see if it does also fall into that same range, because I am confident with the quality of the data. So let me see if I can finish up quickly. That's basically what my letter says. At the end, I gave some management considerations for the county if it chooses to accept drill cuttings. We have said that we want all the oil-based drill cuttings to be hauled by Part 364 permitted haulers. That's a little extra bit of safety factor there. We have talked a little bit with some of the landfills about the experience we're seeing in terms of techniques of placing this material in the fill. You've already learned that you want it up above your line or some distance to avoid radioactivity and leachate. There are other just more basic considerations that the guys will learn as they're working with it, but it is so very dense, you don't put too much of it at once. You kind of layer it with the regular garbage, that kind of thing. We're also going to ask that any landfill that accepts it, track the tonnage that you're accepting and from where, and when you do your reporting to us of all your different types of waste that you've accepted, that be a new category that you add. Because people are going to be interested, people are going to want to know. We want to be able to answer the question, how much of it is taken? So that's about it. Oh, I'll mention the radiation detectors real quickly. That's not a requirement. We realize with the low levels of radiation that are in this stuff, that what's going to happen when these radiation detectors are installed is they're going to trip on other kinds of waste. Medical waste coming in is going to trip the radiation detector. Various other kinds of concrete or brick, loads of brick are going to trip the detector, more likely than Marcellus Shale drill cuttings. But be assured that there's no concern about the detectors being placed in some funny way where they won't actually get a reading. We understand this stuff. We're not looking at it for the first time. These guys in Albany that are reviewing the radiation detector plans have done this at big-time radioactive sites. They know how to deal with the QA/QC, and as was described better than I can describe, they take baseline readings and they calibrate the equipment, and they can get readings that will tell them if there's something coming in that's too hot. But we know what's likely going to happen is once those radiation detectors are in place, they're going to be going off from time to time and slowing down operations, not because of Marcellus Shale drill cuttings, but because of other radioactive things that routinely come into landfills. I guess that's it. I'll just finish by saying again that the Department of Environmental Conservation gives no recommendation. Take them if you want to, don't take them if you don't want to. We have just shown that it's environmentally and under regulation okay to do. The one excellent concern I heard from someone in the public was taking into account capacity concerns. You don't want to use up all your landfill space necessarily with this, but I think you guys have a good handle on your rate of acceptance and what works best for the landfill economically and also capacity-wise. But I thought that was an excellent comment. There may be a day soon when this drilling is happening in New York, and then there may be a whole heck of a lot of this stuff to go somewhere. The fact of the matter is it doesn't have to be put in a landfill. Someone asked that question earlier. This stuff is so innocuous that under law and regulation and good environmental practice, it could be spoiled at the drill site. It could be left right there. The companies that are bringing it up here for disposal are trying to appease their critics. They're trying to do the overly safe thing and say, well, people might criticize us for leaving little pockets of this stuff all over the countryside everywhere we've got a well rig set up. So maybe the best thing is to put it in one of these high-tech double composite lined landfills. That's probably the very, very safest thing we could do, even though it's going to cost us more money, but it actually isn't necessary under regulation or under environmental concerns. And right now, I think the DSGEIS for Marcellus Shale drilling in New York State, it may be changed. It's still just a draft. But I think right now it says that would be the case in New York. These drill cuttings would be allowed to be left right at the drill site where they're generated. I think this is a safe section. That's all I got.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, sure.
Is there any way that this Marcellus Shale would affect the gas coming out of the landfill for electric generation?
I don't think so.
It's not like sheetrock or something that has.
Yeah, ask Hake C&D landfill about that. Since they're a construction and demolition debris landfill, they're mostly full of sheetrock, and they have tremendous problems with sulfur in their landfill gas. I don't think that it would be an issue any more than the concrete and brick and the other things that come into the landfill routinely. It can be sampled for, though, and it may be of interest for someone at some point to run a sample from time to time of what's coming out with the methane in the landfill gas and see if there's any radiological concerns. We don't know of any, we don't believe there'll be any, but it's a reasonable question and maybe should be looked at.
Thank you.
Okay.
Just to finish up, all our major landfill issues, I